likewise, you find Antarctica on some of the world maps that have come down to us. What I'm saying is that there is intriguing evidence in maps which is worth looking at and not throwing away. Then you come to the issue of the geology of the Sphinx. Again, I've gone into this in enormous depth, the work of Robert Schoch and John Anthony West. It's controversial, but the Sphinx does appear to bear the marks of thousands of years of precipitation-induced weathering. And we do not have the climate in the Sahara since the Sphinx is supposed to have been built, which could have created that precipitation-induced weathering. There's a worldwide religious system involving the quest for the immortality of the soul, involving the copying of patterns of stars in the sky in the shape of monuments on the ground, and involving the construction of pyramids. None of these cultures seem to have been in direct contact with one another. I can't help wondering if they inherited a common legacy. Now, I'm not claiming to be right. I'm just saying that monolithic academia, with its fixed focus on a particular view of history, ignores some of this material at its peril. We are constantly, with another turn of the spade, discovering lost civilizations. The Indus Valley civilization was unknown until 1920, but it was a giant civilization that occupied the whole of northern India. So I think that academics may be making an error in writing off the possibility that there has been an earlier episode of high civilization on this planet, and I see my particular job for the last 15 years has been to present the contrary evidence in favor of that, and to do so in a thoroughly documented and detailed way, and to put that information out into the arena of public opinion along with the information of the mainstream. Just another point of view, really.
I think I'd like to take that question for just a second, because at this point, most people are unaware of the fact that within the last 20 or 30 years, geological science, paleontological science, astronomy have all converged on what we could call a catastrophic model of Earth history, which is actually much more in line with the ancient models of world history than some of the more recent academic orthodoxies. And the one thing that's come up here in this discussion is the idea of cycles and so forth. And there is an interesting astronomical component to the date of December 21st, 2012, but it doesn't necessarily imply the end of the world. But the one thing I want to stress is that we modern humans have been around for at least now, the hard evidence suggests 150 to 200,000 years on this planet. With this is same cerebral capacity that we've got now, present day, and but during that time that we humans have been on the planet, we can document at least 12 extraordinary episodes of global change, concentrated global change that's beyond anything we've experienced in our recorded history. And the one that Graham mentioned at the end of the last ice age, there's now just overwhelming evidence from marine geology and from archaeology that there was a major transition in the linear scheme of things at that point. And when one begins to appreciate how extreme some of those changes were, the question almost becomes not so much why would something that preceded that been lost or erased from the planet. The question really becomes, how is it that we humans, or we hominids, are still here? Because, half of the other megafauna, which includes us, any animals over roughly 100 pounds in body weight, half the species of megafauna on Earth did not survive that last transition between roughly 12 and 13,000 years ago at the end of the last ice age. And what we essentially have is a curtain that separates what we think of as our modern historical history that actually begins with cuneiform writing around 4,500 years ago, and the 95% of human history that's missing. And I think what we need to do is begin to rethink the possibilities of what may have occurred in that time from when humans first appeared on this planet by whatever mysterious unknown process, and the time our recorded history began. Because I think that's where the real story is. And I think what we have created now could be considered just an afterthought to everything that has preceded this. And so I think that we need to erect some new models, and those new models, as it turns out, are actually more consistent with some of the archaic models of prehistory. And while we don't have the hard evidence, what we do have is we have the epic stories, we have the myths. So we have traditions that are universal and consistent from all over the world, that there was another order of things before our present order. And so I think what we need to do is go back essentially to square one and rethink the evidence that's now at hand. And there is a mountain of it.
Well, there's also, if you really take a look at, you have precedent in history with a whole bunch of knowledge, a civilization that was very, I would say, high civilization, and suddenly something happened, and basically Rome fell. You know, so you can actually see evidence of a high civilization kind of being taken away based on just the fall of Rome, and then you have the Dark Ages. So it's already happened in recorded history. So I'm actually not the dissenting opinion. I'm agreeing with you guys.
Two-part question. Is there any evidence that links the Mayan calendar to the precession of the zodiac, both in time of the precession and maybe the Mayan calendar perhaps is a division of that? And the other part of the question is there a trace to the origin of the traditional zodiac?
I'll make some comments on that. There certainly is a connection between the Mayan calendar and the precession of the equinoxes. The precession of the equinoxes, for those who don't know, is a change that appears in the background of stars that lie behind the sun at the point that it rises on the spring equinox. The sun always rises due east on the spring equinox, but the background stars slowly change, and they change, we think, because of a wobble on the Earth's axis. The Earth is the viewing platform from which we observe the stars, so changes in the orientation of the Earth will change the appearance and positioning and timing of the stars as they flow past a particular point. And this process unfolds at the rate of 71.6 years for 1 degree, rounded off to 72. There's a fantastic study done by the professor of the history of science at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Giorgio de Santillana, and his colleague Hertha von Deschend, called Hamlet's Mill, which traces in mythology all around the world a series of numbers that are derived from the precession of the equinoxes. It's the only thing they can possibly be derived from. Observations, rather precise observations of this process. And they're all actually multiples of 72. So one of them is 2,160. That's 30 degrees along the ecliptic, times 72 gives you 2,160, and 25,920 years in the entire cycle. Numbers that are related to this sequence of numbers, coupled with mythology of great mills turning and suddenly breaking and having to be recreated, have, in my view, correctly been interpreted as accurate observations of the precession of the equinoxes, encoded in mythology, and then passed down through great storytelling, so that the storyteller no longer had to know the math. They simply had to tell the story true, and the information would be preserved. This suggests that those who encoded that information in the stories in the first place felt that it was extremely important. It so happens that the Mayan calendar contains an enormous number of precessional numbers in its different time periods that it marks out, and I don't think that that's an accident. And it's also right that the Mayan calendar is 1/5 of the precessional cycle, quite closely. And what was your other part of your question?
Is there a known origin to the traditional zodiac?
It's been argued that you can trace some observations of the zodiac right back to the Hall of Bulls in the Cave of Lascaux, because we have the Pleiades on the shoulder of one of the bulls, and the Pleiades are a constellation within the constellation of Taurus. It may well go back that far. It might have been quite difficult for ancient man to have missed this process, actually, if they were observing the heavens in a way that we cannot, suffering from light pollution in cities, and if they were passing down information from generation to generation. It's hard to imagine that they wouldn't have eventually have noticed it. So it may go back a very, very, very long way.
There's one thing I'd like to just bring up, and perhaps the rest of the panel can talk about it in more depth than I will. But there's a man called John Major Jenkins who is one of the better known researchers on the whole issue of the Mayan calendar. And he believes that the real significance is there's going to be a galactic alignment of the Sun, the Earth, and the dark rift at the center of the Milky Way. Not exactly on December 21, 2012, but in this time period.
Roland Emmerich will be very disappointed then.
Well, Roland Emmerich had Hollywood license. We discussed that on John really believes that it's this galactic alignment that's at the center of the significance of why 2012 is important, and perhaps why we're going to see some sort of consciousness shift, which is a big part of the 2012 mythos. There's going to be a shift in consciousness, right? That's a big part of what's being discussed out there, and we can perhaps discuss as a panel what anyone thinks of this idea, but it is a big part of the 2012 concept that's being discussed generally in that community.
Yeah, I think that's the part that fascinates me more than any other, is that, if we look at Emmerich's version, or the doomsday scenarios of massive earthquakes, that's a physical disaster that they're talking about striking, but what you're talking about sounds more like when you say a consciousness shift, that somehow all of us will be changed, not that our world will be changed, and I think that's something that I find fascinating, at least as a concept.
I'd like to jump in for just a second here and elaborate upon something regarding the precessional cycle. The zodiac that we think of when you talk about your birth sign does not coincide anymore with the actual star constellations that gave them their name. They're offset. And this has been going on for about 2,500 years. And one of the problems of astrology is determining what's called the fiducial point, which would be equivalent to this. If you think of today is Sunday, September 5th, at what moment did Sunday, September 5th begin? Well, it began when the sun transited the Greenwich Meridian. And the Greenwich Meridian is essentially our calibration point for marking the beginning of a day. When we look at the beginning of a year, even though our calendar is now out of phase with the astronomical elements, nonetheless, a year is determined by successive transits of the sun from vernal equinox to vernal equinox. When you have this great rotation that Graham was referring to earlier, that is the planet's axis swinging around, we have this constantly changing position or geometry between the vernal equinox and the stars that fall behind it. Well, if you can picture that the solstitial line with two solstices on either end, and at right angles to that, an equinoctial line with the spring and fall equinoxes on it, forming like a great cross in space. And that's rotating at this rate of approximately 25,920 years, to use the sacred number. Okay, well, roughly every 6,000 and some years, one of those arms of the cross will transit the center of the galaxy, which is found approximately between Sagittarius and Capricorn. Okay, now if like I said, one of the principal problems of astrologers for centuries has been determining where do you say is the 0 point when you're actually talking about the stars themselves. Where do you say, okay, this is the beginning of a great year, this completes the cycle? Well, if you study the astronomy of it, there's to me one logical place that you do it. You look at what's a grander scale of things that can be fixed relative to this other motion, and what you have is the plane of the galaxy. And so every 6,400 years roughly, either one of the equinoxes or one of the solstices is going to transit that position in the sky, and which remains fixed relative to the human perspective. And so what we have there is a way of marking time in the grander cycle of things.